Ruth Callahan was 41 years old, and standing on a muddy riverbank, with nothing left to her name but a carpet bag and the clothes on her back, when her late husband's business partner, a smooth-talking man named Wendell Fitch, informed her that their freight company, and everything attached to it, now belonged to him alone. He had papers, he said, signed years ago in the event of exactly this circumstance, and though Ruth had never once seen or heard of such papers in 11 years of marriage to Daniel Callahan, she had no money for a lawyer, and no family left in Missouri to vouch for her word against his. She left the freight office that October morning in 1887 with $19 sewn into her petticoat and a small trunk of her late husband's tools, and she spent nearly all of it 3 days later on a battered, waterlogged river ferry, moored and forgotten at the far end of the Missouri River landing, outside the town of Larkspur Bend, a vessel so long abandoned that nobody in town could say with any certainty who it had once belonged to, or why it had simply been left to rot against the pilings. She paid $11 for it, to the quiet pity of the dockhands who assumed she'd lost her senses along with her husband. What none of them knew, what Ruth herself did not yet understand as she stepped aboard that groaning, sun-bleached deck, was that sealed inside the ferry's forgotten cargo hold lay a journal that would not only reveal who the vessel truly belonged to, but would restore a name, a fortune, and a promise to an entire river town that had spent 30 years believing itself forgotten. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Ruth Callahan. If there's a place in your own life that everyone else had already written off, tell us about it in the comments below. Ruth had been born in 1846 on a modest farm along the Missouri's eastern bluffs, the third of 5 children raised by a riverboat pilot named Joseph Marsh and his wife Sarah, a woman known throughout the county for her steady hands and her stubborn refusal to let any misfortune go unmet without a plan. Joseph Marsh spent most of Ruth's childhood away on the river itself, guiding freight boats and passenger packets between St. Louis and the smaller landings scattered along the water. And when he was home, he filled the house with stories of the river's moods, its shifting sandbars and sudden snags, the particular way a current spoke to a man who had learned to listen for it. Ruth, more than any of her siblings, listened. She spent her girlhood summers down at the landing near their farm, watching the boats come and go, learning to read the water's surface for the telltale ripples that meant danger below, absorbing without quite realizing it the whole vocabulary of river life, the calls of the deckhands, the rhythm of the paddle wheels, the particular hush that fell over a crew when a boat approached a difficult passage. It was her mother, though, who taught her the skill that would matter most in the years to come. Sarah Marsh kept meticulous records of every debt owed to the family, and every debt the family owed in turn, a habit born not of any natural love for numbers, but of hard necessity, since a riverboat pilot's income arrived unevenly, and a household had to be managed with an unforgiving precision if it meant to survive the lean months between contracts. A ledger doesn't forget what a person conveniently might, Sarah used to say, and she taught Ruth from an early age to keep her own small accounts, to track not just money, but promises, dates, and names, so that nothing of consequence ever slipped entirely from memory. Ruth absorbed this lesson so thoroughly that by the time she was 16, she had taken over the keeping of her father's own shipping ledgers whenever he was home, cross-referencing cargo manifests against payments received with a diligence that impressed even the gruff merchants who sometimes tried to shortchange a riverman's family. Ruth met Daniel Callahan in the spring of 1876, when she was 30 years old, and had long since resigned herself, in the quiet way of women who had watched too many suitors come and go, to a life spent caring for her aging parents, rather than building a household of her own. Daniel arrived in the county as a freight agent, representing a small shipping concern out of St. Louis. A patient, soft-spoken man, with an evident respect for the river his own father had once worked, and he and Ruth fell into an easy partnership, almost before either of them recognized it as courtship. Long conversations about cargo routes and seasonal water levels, that gradually, without either of them quite marking the moment, became something warmer. They married that autumn, and together they built a modest freight operation of their own, along the river's central stretch, ferrying goods and produce between the smaller landing towns that the larger shipping lines considered too minor to bother with. It was unglamorous work, but honest, and Ruth kept its books with the same careful diligence her mother had taught her, tracking every contract and every payment in a hand so precise that Daniel often joked he could find any transaction of the past decade within minutes, simply by asking his wife. It was through this work that Ruth first heard, in scattered fragments over the years, the story of old Silas Whitfield, a riverman who had operated a small but well-regarded ferry service out of Larkspur Bend, decades before Ruth and Daniel's marriage, ferrying passengers and freight across a notoriously difficult stretch of the Missouri, where the current ran treacherous and the crossing points shifted with every spring flood. Whitfield had been, by every account Ruth ever gathered, a man of unusual generosity for the trade, known to carry farmers and their goods across for a fraction of the going rate when the harvest had been poor, and to extend credit freely to families he trusted to make it good eventually. He had, the old-timers said, spoken often of wanting to establish something more lasting than a single ferry, a proper landing, warehouses, perhaps even a small settlement that could serve as a fair and reliable crossing point for the whole stretch of river, a counterweight to the larger shipping concerns that increasingly controlled trade along the Missouri's more profitable routes. But Whitfield had vanished from the region sometime in the late 1850s, and his ferry along with him, and what had become of either the man or the vessel, was, by the time Ruth heard the story, little more than a half-remembered footnote in the older rivermen's recollections, the kind of tale traded over winter fires and rarely examined too closely. The fall, when it arrived, came with the particular cruelty of a betrayal, built patiently over years rather than delivered in a single blow. Daniel Callahan died in the winter of 1886, thrown from the deck of a freight barge during an ice-choked crossing that should never have been attempted, and though Ruth grieved him with the full weight of 11 years of shared partnership, she believed, in the numbness of those first weeks, that the freight business at least remained secure, that Wendell Fitch, Daniel's business partner of some 4 years, would honor the informal understanding the two men had always operated under, that the company and its modest assets belonged equally to both, and would pass, in the event of either man's death, to his widow or heirs. She was wrong, and cruelly so. Fitch produced, within a month of Daniel's funeral, a set of partnership papers Ruth had never seen, papers that named him sole proprietor in the event of Daniel's death or incapacity, papers Ruth suspected, though could never prove, had been drafted and signed under circumstances Daniel himself might not have fully understood, given how trusting he had always been of a partner he considered a friend. Ruth fought the claim as best she could, traveling to the county seat to consult the one attorney willing to hear her case. A tired, sympathetic man named Horace Pruitt, who told her plainly that without her husband's own countervailing documents, which had apparently been lost, destroyed, or perhaps never existed at all, and without money enough to mount a serious legal challenge against a man of Fitch's local standing, she had little real recourse. She spent that bitter winter watching Fitch absorb the freight company's boats, contracts, and warehouse space into his own growing operation, offering her, at one point, a small severance she recognized immediately as an insult dressed up as generosity, and which she refused. By the time spring arrived, she had exactly $19 sewn into her petticoat, a trunk containing Daniel's few personal tools and effects, and a hollow, aching fury she had learned, over that long winter, to keep entirely off her face, understanding that a woman seen to be angry was a woman easily dismissed as unreasonable, while a woman who appeared calm might yet be underestimated long enough to find her footing. It was Horace Pruitt, in fact, who mentioned almost in passing that the county was preparing to clear its rolls of abandoned river property that spring, vessels and landings that had sat unclaimed and untaxed for so long that the assessors simply wished to be rid of the paperwork attached to them. Ruth had not planned to attend the small dockside sale that followed, having half convinced herself she ought to take what little money she had and start fresh somewhere upriver, where the Callahan and Fitch names meant nothing at all. But something drew her down to the Larkspur Bend, landing on the appointed morning nonetheless. Some old habit of her father's teaching that told her a person ought always to look carefully at what the world was offering before deciding it held nothing left worth having. And there, moored at the farthest and least trafficked end of the landing, half sunk at one corner and green with river moss, she saw the old Ferry, a vessel nobody at the sale could quite say belonged to anyone, its registration lost to time, its hull weathered gray by decades of sun and water, looking for all the world like exactly the kind of foolish purchase a grieving widow with more sentiment than sense might make. When the auctioneer read off its description with evident boredom, opening bid $5, nobody else so much as glanced its way. Ruth raised her hand and offered 11, and she heard, quite clearly, one of the dockhands mutter that poor widow Callahan had gone and bought herself a coffin that floated. She paid it anyway, and walked the short distance down the landing that same afternoon to see what she had bought. The ferry was, by any reasonable measure, barely seaworthy. Its deckboards had rotted through in several places. Its paddle wheel hung crooked and half collapsed against one side, and the whole vessel listed faintly toward the water, as though it had long ago made peace with the idea of eventually sinking altogether. But Ruth, walking its length that first afternoon, with the same careful attention her father had once taught her to give any vessel, however humble, noticed something the casual eye would have missed entirely. A small cargo hold beneath the aft deck, its hatch nearly concealed beneath decades of accumulated debris, sealed shut not merely by rust and neglect, but by what appeared, on closer inspection, to be a deliberately fitted iron latch, the kind of fastening a person installed when they intended something to stay hidden rather than merely stored. It took her the better part of 2 days, working alone, with tools from Daniel's own trunk, to work the corroded latch free, and when the hatch finally gave way, with a groan of protesting hinges, she found, in the dim space below, a small oilskin-wrapped bundle sitting atop a modest collection of tools and supplies that had clearly not been disturbed in decades. She carried the bundle up into the daylight and unwrapped it there on the sun-warmed deck. And inside, she found a leather-bound journal, its pages foxed and brittle, but entirely legible, along with several folded documents and a small drawstring pouch that, when she loosened its cord, revealed a modest quantity of gold coin, wrapped carefully enough that the years had not diminished it in the slightest. Ruth carried the journal back to the small rented room she had taken above Larkspur Bend's general store, and she spent the following 3 evenings reading it by candlelight, with a growing sense of wonder that gradually, as the pages accumulated, curdled into something closer to grief and outrage combined. The journal, she came to understand, belonged to none other than Silas Whitfield himself, the vanished ferryman of local legend, and its entries, spanning nearly 2 years in his own careful, deliberate hand, told a story considerably more complicated than the half-remembered tale the old-timers still traded over winter fires. Whitfield had written, in increasingly troubled entries, dated through 1857 and into 1858, of his growing conviction that the region's dominant shipping concern, a company controlled by a ruthless merchant named Augustus Reeve, intended to force him out of the crossing entirely, not through fair competition, but through deliberate sabotage, cut mooring lines, poisoned wells at his landing. False rumors spread among the farmers he served, suggesting his crossings were unsafe. Whitfield had documented each incident with the same careful precision Ruth's own mother had once taught her to bring to any ledger, dates and witnesses and losses, all recorded meticulously, building, page by page, a case he clearly intended to bring before the territorial authorities once he had gathered evidence enough to make it stick. The final entries told the darker part of the story. Whitfield had written that he intended to travel upriver to formally file his complaint and, more crucially, to record with the Territorial Land Office his long-planned claim to establish a proper settlement at the crossing, a legal filing that would have granted him, and by extension, the community he hoped to build there, permanent and protected rights to the landing that Reeves' company so badly wanted for itself. He had hidden this journal, along with a portion of his savings and, most importantly, a set of survey documents supporting his settlement claim, inside his own ferry's cargo hold, the entries explained, precisely because he no longer trusted that his lodgings on shore were safe from those who wished to see his plans fail. And then, with a final entry dated the night before his departure upriver, the journal simply stopped. Whitfield, Ruth would later confirm, through careful inquiry among the oldest residents of Larkspur Bend, had never been seen again after that night, and the ferry, presumably left moored and waiting for a return that never came, had simply drifted into the long, uneasy forgetting that had left it, 30 years later, sitting unclaimed and unwanted at the very edge of the same landing he had once hoped to transform. Ruth sat with this knowledge for the better part of a week before she fully understood its weight. It explained, with a clarity that left her chest tight with sorrow for a man she had never known, why Larkspur Bend had remained, across 3 decades, exactly the small and struggling town it had always been, its potential as a proper river crossing never realized, its farmers still paying whatever rates the larger shipping concerns cared to charge because no one had ever successfully established the fair, independent landing Whitfield had once envisioned. And she understood, too, with a certainty that settled into her, the way the river itself settled into its banks each spring, that she was holding in her two hands not merely the explanation for one man's long-ago disappearance, but the legal and moral foundation to finally build the very thing Reeves' company had once murdered a man's dream to prevent. Though whether Whitfield himself had met with violence, or simply vanished into some quieter misfortune, the journal alone could not say for certain, and Ruth resolved she would not claim more than the evidence could support. She began cautiously, first taking the journal and its accompanying survey documents to the county land office to inquire, as neutrally as she could manage, whether an old, unfiled settlement claim from 1858 might still hold any legal standing if properly documented and pursued by an interested party. The clerk, an elderly man named Otis Reems, who remembered Whitfield personally from his own boyhood, examined the documents with evident astonishment and confirmed that while the original claim had indeed lapsed for want of filing, the survey work itself, being sound and properly witnessed, could support a fresh claim if Ruth chose to file one in her own right as the Ferry's current legal owner, since the vessel and its contents had passed to her clean through the county's own abandoned property sale. It was Otis Reems, too, who mentioned, almost as an aside, that the modern incarnation of Augustus Reeves' old shipping concern, now run by his son Cornelius Reeve, still controlled nearly every profitable crossing along that stretch of river, and still charged Larkspur Bend's farmers rates that had grown, over the decades, increasingly difficult for the smaller operations to bear. It did not take long for word to reach Cornelius Reeve that the widow Callahan had filed a settlement claim at the old Whitfield crossing, and Reeve, a man who had inherited his father's instincts along with his father's business, moved quickly to discourage her. He sent a representative to Larkspur Bend within the fortnight, a smooth, well-dressed man who offered to purchase Ruth's claim outright for a sum that would have made her comfortable for years, framing it as a generous kindness to a struggling widow rather than the preemptive maneuver it plainly was. When Ruth declined, the pressure grew less subtle. Merchants who had begun extending her small credits for ferry repairs suddenly found reasons to withdraw them. A rumor began circulating that the old ferry's hull was rotted beyond any hope of safe operation, a rumor Ruth suspected, though could not prove, originated from Reeves' own company. She persisted regardless, patching the vessel's worst damage with her own hands and whatever material she could afford, drawing on the modest gold she had found in the cargo hold with the same careful economy her mother had once taught her, and slowly, cautiously, she began ferrying small loads across the river herself, at rates considerably fairer than anything Reeves' company offered. The turning point came not through any single dramatic confrontation, but through the accumulation of quiet, undeniable fact. Ruth had spent her evenings, alongside her ferry repairs, carefully documenting every instance she could verify of Reeves' company, inflating its rates beyond what the original territorial shipping regulations permitted, cross-referencing old contracts and receipts with the same diligence she had once brought to her husband's freight ledgers, until she had assembled a record every bit as methodical as the one Whitfield himself had kept 30 years before. When Cornelius Reeve, growing impatient with her continued presence at the crossing, attempted to have her settlement claim invalidated before the Territorial Land Commission on the grounds that a woman alone could not properly establish or maintain a river landing, Ruth appeared before that commission herself, journal, survey documents, and her own carefully assembled evidence of decades of overcharging, all laid out with the calm, unhurried precision her mother had drilled into her since girlhood. She did not accuse Reeve of anything she could not prove, speaking instead simply and factually of what Silas Whitfield had documented, what the surviving townsfolk of Larkspur Bend remembered, and what her own records now showed about the rates the community had been paying in the absence of any fair alternative. The Commission's ruling, when it came that summer, granted Ruth's settlement claim in full, recognizing both the validity of Whitfield's original 1858 survey and Ruth's own diligent stewardship of the crossing in the months since her claim was filed, and though Cornelius Reeve's company suffered no formal legal penalty for its decades of inflated rates, since no law had technically been broken, the public nature of the commission hearing did what quiet justice so often does in small river towns. It made the truth impossible to unknow. Farmers who had grudgingly paid Reeve's rates, for want of any alternative, began bringing their goods to Ruth's newly legitimized crossing instead, drawn by both the fairer price and the simple, growing knowledge of what Whitfield had once tried to build there, and what Reeve's own father had apparently done to stop him. Ruth used the last of the ferry's hidden gold, along with the modest income the crossing began generating, to properly rebuild the landing exactly as Whitfield's old survey had envisioned it. A warehouse, a proper dock, a small trading post that welcomed every farmer along that stretch of river at rates that would not change with the seasons or the size of a family's purse. She named the rebuilt landing Whitfield's Crossing, over the modest objections of townsfolk who wanted to name it for her instead, insisting that the honor belonged to the man whose careful documentation, hidden away for 30 years, had finally made the whole restoration possible. She had the old journal itself framed and displayed in the new trading post's front room. Not as a curiosity, but as a reminder, she told anyone who asked, that a promise once made in good faith did not simply cease to matter because the man who made it had vanished before he could see it fulfilled. And so we return, as we always do, to where we began, to a woman of 41, cast out with $19 and a trunk of tools, who paid $11 for a half-sunk ferry nobody in Larkspur Bend could even say belonged to anyone, and found sealed inside its forgotten cargo hold, not merely gold, though there was gold, but a 30-year-old promise waiting patiently to be kept. They called her a fool that October morning at the landing, certain she had bought herself nothing more than a slow, waterlogged ruin, and in the strictest sense, perhaps she had. Foolish enough to see worth in a vessel the whole town had already written off. Foolish enough to spend her last coins chasing a mystery she could not have named. Foolish enough to trust that patience and careful record-keeping, the very qualities her mother had once drilled into her at a kitchen table decades before, might yet set right a wrong 3 decades old. It is, we think, the best kind of foolishness there is, and Ruth Callahan wore it, in the end, like a quiet kind of grace. Thank you for spending this evening with Ruth's story, with a forgotten ferry, a vanished riverman's journal, and a river crossing that waited 30 years to become what it was always meant to be. If her patience moved you, we'd love for you to share this story with someone who might need the reminder that a thing left behind is not the same as a thing without worth. And before you go, we'll leave you with this. What is a promise, made by someone else, that you've found yourself in a position to keep? Tell us in the comments below. We read every one. Until next time, stay close.